there's not a ton of point in us before somebody has encountered Jesus trying to like cast visions and make arguments for them about what their life with Jesus will look like and why they ought to do this, that, or the other thing. It seems to me that really until somebody has an encounter with Jesus, the fruitful conversation to have about Jesus is, okay, so there's this Jesus guy. He may totally wreck your life as he has done with mine, and it's totally worth it.
Welcome to the theformed.life podcast, where we aim to help you follow Jesus in all of life. I'm Bill, and I serve as the campus pastor at our Brookside campus.
Yeah, and I'm Paul, and I serve as the campus pastor at our Shawnee campus, and we're grateful that you're joining us today for this important conversation. You know, the New Testament book of Romans is one of the most important pieces of literature to have ever been written, and almost right away, at the end of chapter 1, the Apostle Paul addresses a topic that is regularly discussed in our cultural moment: same-sex sexual relationships.
Yeah, that's right. And to help us better understand this passage and to have a broader conversation about how our church can care for those in the LGBTQ community, we are honored to spend some time interviewing our guest, Dr. Greg Coles.
Yeah, we really were so thrilled to get him as a guest on the pod. Dr. Coles is a senior research fellow at the Center for Faith, Sexuality and Gender, which is led by Dr. Preston Sprinkle. And Greg holds a PhD in English from Penn State and has written 2 books. The first is about his own journey in faith and sexual identity, titled Single Gay Christian. And the second is more recent and is titled No Longer Strangers, subtitled Finding Belonging in a World of Alienation.
And as you're about to hear, Greg brings a number of important insights to this nuanced conversation. We hope you enjoy it.
Well, Greg, thank you so much for taking some time to be here with us today.
Oh, it's my delight. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, as you know, we have undertaken preaching the book of Romans here at Christ Community Church, which is really exciting. I love the book of Romans, but I'll also be really honest, it's incredibly daunting to think through preaching this epistle of the Apostle Paul, and that's true for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
But one reason, and kind of more specifically why we invited you to here today to be with us, is that pretty quickly within Romans, you get to a challenging passage at the end of Romans chapter 1, verses 26 through 32, where the Apostle Paul spends some time discussing same-sex sexual relationships. And so we'd love your help setting the stage, so to speak, on this passage. And if you could maybe start by actually just summarizing how you read the flow of Paul's thought in those verses in that passage.
Yeah, for sure. So it's probably most helpful to give ourselves a bit of a running start, which, I'm sure you've already unpacked the earlier part of Romans 1 with, great success. So forgive me for the redundancy. But just to recognize that broadly, the argument Paul's making in the latter part of Romans 1 is about how, God's work is visible in the world, like God has made himself discoverable. And yet people keep choosing to discover all these other things instead of God.
Yeah.
People keep seeing what God has done and then being like, but actually, I'm going to worship the creation instead of the creator. I'm going to look to all these things that God has made to point to himself, and I'm instead going to just look at those things. I'm going to look at the signposts as if they are the final thing. And so as we get to this later part of the passage, then Paul is making the argument that one way we see this expressed is in how we're coming to questions of sexuality and sexual expression, among other things, right? Sex turns out to be the first in a list of ways that human beings have found themselves living lives that reflect our greater commitment to the thing created instead of to the creator who's behind all of them. And so I think it's helpful in that context. And it's also helpful, again, giving ourselves sort of a broad, situated understanding of the text. It's helpful, too, to know that once we get through this kind of extensive vice list, all the ways in which human beings variously seek out for things that are not God to sort of fill the God function in our lives, then we get to this point right at the beginning of chapter 2 where Paul says, like, you therefore have no excuse, you who cast judgment on someone else. At the very point you cast judgment, you yourself stand condemned because you do the very same things.
Yes.
So it's helpful to remember right, by that context, we know what we're talking about here is a broadly human principle that all of us keep casting about for things that are not God to try to fill that space in our lives. And we know if any of us get through reading Romans 1 and think that we have found a really good excuse to consider ourselves superior to someone else, we're doing it wrong, because Paul gives us like a nice little reader's guide, and he's like, that's the wrong way to read what I just said. You have no excuse. So yeah, that's how I would frame the broad argument. But we can talk through, if you want, sort of the particulars of that specific passage that seems most clearly to address same-sex sexual expression.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate the broad framing and the inclusion of where he goes at the beginning of chapter 2. I just know myself well enough to know that's how I would have done it, and it's the Apostle Paul knows humanity well enough to know I'm going to answer the question or respond to the problem before it's a thing.
Yeah.
Before it but we tend to forget to read the Bible that way, and we can isolate in on these small chunks without remembering how important the broader, even immediate literary context is.
Yeah, and in that Weissel, I think there's actually 21 things that he lists, which I know some scholars even argued that's a 3 times 7, which is kind of, even as Paul intentionally making a list of the 7's a number of completion times 3 is a complete way, a statement of all the ways in which we worship the creation rather than the creator. So that's really helpful, Greg, and just thank you. And generally speaking, the two sides of the debate, because we do, when it talks about same-sex sexual expression there, that is a passage where I think some of us can kind of be reading along in Romans and gospel and good news and all this, and all of a sudden it's whoa, this now in our cultural context feels like a big defeat or a big barrier to even just reading the next sentence, and maybe just closing this thing altogether and putting it aside. And so I just wonder, as people have tried to wrestle with
those
this
verses,
and understand them. In the broader conversation, there's kind of two ways of reading that text. There's lots of ways of reading that text, but kind of two broad camps that people fall into. And sometimes they're referred to as either affirming or non-affirming. And these positions, sometimes you'll hear the language of side A or side B as we talk about that and how our posture towards reading those and the interpretive framework that we bring to that. But so can you just help us with some definitional work there and just even summarize what those affirming and non-affirming interpretations are in that passage as it relates to same-sex sexual expression and practice?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is, I think one thing both sides of that debate, right, the debate here being over the question of, is same-sex marriage a possibility for followers of Jesus? Is that a context in which followers of Jesus can steward their sexual expression?
Mm-hmm.
And folks on one side would say yes, even this passage, which seems to say same-sex sexual behavior not a good thing, that actually still fits within a vision of Christian living where you can pursue same-sex marriage, faithful, monogamous, loving covenant. Right. And then the other side of that conversation would be folks like me, whose conviction is, I don't think God has anything against me as somebody who, finds myself attracted to the same sex, but I also don't believe that same-sex marriage is an option for me as a follower of Jesus. But I think both sides of that debate here, neither of us would see this passage in Romans as the key clincher of the debate, right? My understanding of what marriage is largely framed by other things, and this sort of fits into that as a piece of the bigger puzzle.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think on the other side, they would also look at this and say, well, yeah, this is a tricky passage to deal with, but we're going to try to make sense of it in the context of a larger. So the debate, big picture, is about a whole bunch of stuff, of which Romans 1 is just one little piece. Having said that, let's dig into the particulars of what we see going on here. There are. Again, on its face, the text of this particular passage, and I'll read just the couple verses that are, I think, most relevant here. Verse 26 and 27, because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. So there we have, kind of on its face, it seems pretty intense and pretty sort of inescapable, right? Seems to clearly speak to same-sex sexual behavior. And one thing that makes this passage especially notable among all of the passages in Scripture that maybe address same-sex sexual behavior is this is the only one that talks about female same-sex sexual behavior.
Yes,
Everything
right.
else is just talking about men.
Yes.
Right. The two passages in Leviticus just say, if man lies with man. And then our Greek word arsenokoitai that shows up in 1 Corinthians 6 and 1 Timothy 1, that the arsene of that arsenokoitai means male. So we're just talking
Right.
about male sexual behavior everywhere else. This is the one time where women seem to show up. So that's notable and significant to the conversation. But there are a few reasons, a few arguments that focus on what you've called the side A, or the same-sex marriage affirming side of the conversation. A few arguments that I think are most frequently made here in terms of other ways of interpreting this passage that are not sort of the plain sense of the text. And I think all of these arguments have some merit to them in the sense that I think they observe something that could be true about the text. And yet I don't find them ultimately convincing because, as I said, all of us are trying to interact with this one little passage in the context of a much bigger conversation about
That's right.
what is marriage and what does it mean to steward our sexuality within the context of the marriage or singleness that God calls us to.
That's right.
So these arguments, the first significant argument coming from sort of the side A, or the same-sex marriage affirming side, would be that what's being condemned here is not sort of a loving stewardship of sexual expression in a monogamous context, but it's really about lust gone wild, right? Because you see, and it's correct that you do see in the passage this emphasis of like, this is, we're talking about out of control lust here. We're talking about unrestrained passions.
Yeah.
And so one argument that's made is, well, this is condemning when people are responding out of lust, not when people are choosing to, steward their sexual attraction in the context of monogamous marriage. Another argument that's a little more, it gets a little more into the weeds of the text, but it has to do with the phrases, the phrase against nature,
Yes.
paraphusin in the Greek.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of debate about what it means for a thing to be against nature. The one other place where we see that phrase show up in the New Testament, interestingly, is in 1 Corinthians 11, I believe, where Paul is talking about proper order in worship and women covering their heads. And he says, doesn't the very order of things, doesn't the very phusin teach you that it's improper for a woman to not have her head covered in worship? And so if you're asking the question, what does it mean for something to be paraphusin? And you say, well, Paul used phusin to describe women covering their heads in worship. So, and we mostly think of that as a pretty culturally contextual thing now.
Right.
Many of us in our churches do not have women covering their heads. So if women aren't covering their heads anymore, then maybe Paul is also speaking to something cultural here. One specific argument that's made, and here I should have asked you beforehand how what's the rating of this podcast?
I hope high.
Yeah, well, no. I think it's definitely R-rated for sure. Yeah, we are dealing with some very intense stuff on sexual assault. Yeah,
okay.
So
we also do hope that people give us 5 stars.
Yeah,
that's what I thought you meant, Greg.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're being rated 5 stars all around. But yes, I was about to say something a bit R-rated.
I
Is
understand.
that acceptable?
Bill understood. Yeah.
Go for that. Go for that.
So one argument for which the textual evidence is, I think, a little bit hairy. One argument that's made is that the discussion of women is actually not talking about women having sex with women, but when it says women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones, the argument is that it's actually talking about anal sex. Because there do seem to be some cases where the phrase paraphusin is perhaps used as a description specifically of anal sex, which of course can exist in the context of same-sex male sexual interaction, but can also exist in the context of male and female interaction. And so that the argument of that particular sort of scholarly approach is, if what's being said in in the first part of the passage, it's not talking about women in same-sex relationships, but it's actually talking about women who are willingly choosing to participate in anal sex with their spouses or with other sexual male partners, and that therefore that then becomes sort of the way women are willing to break out of the boundaries of the proper use of sex within marriage reflects people who are also breaking out of the proper uses of sex. So there are questions about what does it mean for a thing to be against nature, and that sort of rolls out into a third argument or a fourth. I've lost track of the number of arguments I've given you at this point, which is that the thing that's being condemned here is not a same-sex oriented person, not somebody who's truly gay or lesbian entering a same-sex sexual relationship, but it's someone for whom that would be against their nature. So it's if you are by nature heterosexual, but you become so inflamed with lust that you just, you're a heterosexual man, but you can't get enough sex with women. And so driven by lust, you decide, let's try some same-sex sexual activity too, just to fill the bucket a little fuller. And so the argument there is by going against nature, that's really only a condemnation if it's not naturally within your nature to pursue same-sex sexual expression. But if it is, if you are truly oriented toward the same sex, then it's actually proper and fitting for you to pursue same-sex relationship in that way. So those would be, I think, some of the key arguments here. Oh, one more I should throw into the pot is the idea that what's being condemned here, if we think about the context of the Roman readership to whom Paul is writing.
Yes, that's right.
That we see things like cultic practices. We see the sexual excesses of the Roman emperors, who both we see kind of like wanton, unrestrained sexual activity kind of across the board in the Roman context. And we see specifically that kind of sexual behavior related to things like cultic religious practices, worship of the pagan gods. And so in that sense, the thing that Paul is concerned with, the affirming side would argue, the thing Paul's concerned with here is not all categorical same-sex sexual behavior, but it is rather the specific kinds of sexual behavior that he's seeing in the context of Rome, which is things like people using same-sex sexual behavior as a part of pagan worship, people turning to same-sex sexual behavior because they're driven by excessive lust, and so on. And so then that affirming argument would say, well, therefore, like, we can be fully on board with the context that Paul is arguing against and say, like, yeah, Paul was right to condemn those kinds of same-sex behavior, right, but he's not making a broader categorical argument.
Yeah, he's not talking about the kind of thing that we're talking about today and our current culture of these loving, committed same-sex relationships. He just doesn't have those in view. That would be the argument.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. So you said there's some things that reveals that are maybe helpful, but at the end of the day, you're not personally ultimately persuaded by those arguments. And so I'd love to hear, how do you? And we've mentioned a couple of times this kind of broader story of the Bible and a broader framework which this is one piece. This one passage is as a piece of that bigger story. But how would you respond to some of those arguments, and maybe I just even love to hear you kind of positively articulate what's the vision for sexuality that you see unfolding in the whole of Scripture, to which this then fits in as a part of.
Let me start. I'll start with the particular passage, and then we'll gesture out to the
that's
bigger
great.
stuff.
That's great. Love it.
So in this particular passage, there are a few cases where, again, I'm sympathetic to the way these arguments are saying, like, well, let's be cautious in not assuming too much of this passage. And I recognize that concern. And yet I also want to try to read a text in the way that it seems most like it wants to be read. And it does seem like there is some logic within this text that I think speaks pretty broadly to questions of same-sex sexual expression. So for instance, when we talk about the idea that, like, well, Paul's just concerned with excessive lust, not like a fruitful application of lust. I think though we see him talk about lust as a matter of concern. And indeed, I do agree that lust is a matter of concern. The framing of the language here really doesn't just limit it to, well, and it's just bad because it's lustful. But he does seem to say, right, fitting it in with the broader argument of Romans 1, he seems to say, here's a context in which an example of people turning in on themselves is people saying, hey, I'm going to, instead of using my body sexually for the things that the Creator intends it for, I'm going to look at created things and decide for myself which of those created things do I want and why, and how can I make this fundamentally about me. And again, I don't think same-sex sexual relationships are the only thing in the world that can be guilty of that concern. Because again, as we saw, Romans 1 is
Romans 1 doesn't think that.
Ding ding, precisely.
Right. Right.
And yet I do think, though I think Paul's using it as an example of this broader argument, I think the language he uses to make that point is really broad enough to say, hey, we're talking broadly here about all kinds of sexual behavior that don't fit in with God's created vision for sexual expression. Now, of course, that sparks the bigger question, like, what is God's created vision for sexual expression, which we'll talk about momentarily. But again, I think as we get a grasp on that bigger vision, when we look at this particular passage, it does seem to me that Paul is saying, hey, the context in which we would turn toward the same sex, as well as many contexts in which we would turn toward the opposite sex outside of God's vision for that expression, those would all be places where we take sex, this really good created thing, and we make it into something that is no longer about the pursuit of the Creator and turns it into something that's about ourselves. Yes, if I needed to read this passage in such a way that I could make it fit a view that affirms same-sex marriage, I could read it that way. I could find a way to read it, but I don't think, if I try to just sort of hold the text openly and let it speak for itself, I don't find that the most compelling reading. Yeah. But that to me is compelling in large part because, again, when we look at this broader picture, it seems to me that from the very beginning, we see something really significant about the distinction between male and female as it relates to the covenant of marriage. And so we see this in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, right? We have this, for its time, really countercultural vision of the createdness of human beings, male and female in the image of God.
Yes.
Which is just wild, right? Because everybody else around that time, Plato's out writing that women are just like inside out men, like they yes. Women are like yes. men with a disorder. It's like, right. Oh, what a bummer, you turned out female, like should have been inside out. So like we have this really really misogynistic view of women generally, and into this world we have a scripture that says, actually, if you want to understand what God looks like in the world, you can't just look at men.
No,
you actually
right.
need to look both at male and female in order to understand kind of this fuller vision of how God has chosen to express himself in his images in the world. And then in Genesis 2, then we see that one of the logics of male and female existing together is that enables them to be fruitful and multiply. And significantly too, Jesus then, so Genesis 2 has that significant passage, all right, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. And Jesus in Matthew 19, as well as I think a couple other intertextual points in Mark and Luke and the other synoptics, but Matthew 19, Jesus is asked a question about divorce, and given the opportunity to make kind of a broad, formative statement about marriage, Jesus points to two places in Genesis. He points to that Genesis 2, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife. But before he does that, he says, haven't you heard that in the beginning the Creator created them male and female?
That's right.
Yeah. And then he says, therefore, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother. And so Jesus himself seems to find something really deeply spiritually significant one might even say a bit sacramental about the power of marriage to represent the sort of the fullness of the vision of God's image as being both male and female by joining those two distinct pieces of God's image in the covenant of marriage. And so because marriage has that symbolic power to point back to the beauty of the bigness of who God is, it seems to me that anytime we have a marriage in which we don't have both male and female, we miss out on something of that beautiful sacramental power of marriage to point to kind of the fullness of God's expression of himself in human beings.
Well, and to tie Romans 1 back into that, creation language is all over that passage in Romans 1 that we've just discussed at length.
That's right.
I mean, it seems, Paul is such a brilliant writer and was so versed in Torah that doesn't seem incidental or accidental to me. And so that's one of the other, to me, strengths when we actually zero back in on the passage, that Paul seems to want his readers, both original readers and us, to be thinking of Genesis 1, to be thinking of Genesis 2 as we're engaging kind of his broader argument and the specifics of that passage that we've already discussed. So, that stands out to me as well.
Yeah.
Well, and what you named there too, Greg, about how Jesus links, he made the male and female, and then the therefore in his kind of statement on those questions is even, and this is what I hear you saying, is that actually it seems like that sex difference is like a key part of how Jesus understands the covenant of marriage, that sexual difference is a part of how he's designed that covenant. And that's, again, you might say sacramental picture, which is really, I think that's a great insight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I'm tempted to take us in all kinds of directions, but I should probably refrain.
Well, do you have anything that's particularly on the top of your mind or the tip of your tongue about either Romans 1 or kind of the broader framework of marriage, or kind of anything? We do have a couple other questions to step out and frame a little bit more broadly, but I don't want to lose an opportunity if you've got something that's really burning for you.
I mean, I think I'll just make this very brief pitch for the significance of things like valuing the leadership giftedness of women in the body of believers. And granted, this opens up perhaps all kinds of balls of wax. Are we complementarian or egalitarian? I don't know. I probably should have Googled your church before I sat down for this podcast. I will say what I'm about to say from an admittedly
go there, Greg. We love
egalitarian standpoint. But it seems to me, even if you're a complementarian, I think it is greatly important for us to recognize that as we understand the significance, the fact that God is saying, even within a marriage, I would like to see the marriage reflect kind of the fullness of my creative vision of male and female in the image of God. If the marriage needs to reflect that fullness, how much more does our collective body need to reflect God's created vision in imbuing both male and female with distinct and distinctly significant aspects of who God is, in such a way that I think anytime our theology keeps us from creating opportunity for both men and women to serve and lead within the context of the gifting that God has given them, we are thereby impoverished. And so, at least for me, the reasons that I do not believe same-sex marriage is God's best for me are very much the same reasons that I'm really, really deeply in favor of women serving in all ministry roles. But again, even if you're not in a place where you share that particular theological conviction with me, I would urge you greatly to think about the ways in which the significance of God's creative vision for male and female means that we need to be really, really thoughtful in making sure that no part of the body of Christ is seen as subsidiary.
Yeah.
Oh man, amen.
Well, and Jen Wilkin, who is certainly a complementarian herself, but has done a lot in the area of how do we equip women to teach and lead and these kinds of things. She recently remarked, I love this. She said, when God said it was not good for a man to be alone, He didn't give him an elder board; He gave him Eve. And so, and she's coming from the complementarian perspective. But just to this very point that you have, Greg, of how are we. It takes the fullness of male and female together to image God and to represent Him in the world, and so I'm really
glad God didn't give Adam an elder board. And actually, an earlier episode of this podcast, we kind of wrestle with some of that within our.
We just have actually done a big kind of reworking of our paper and stuff on that. So we'll put that in the show notes. We have an earlier conversation where we're talking about male and female in church leadership and biblical theology.
So a timely tie-in for sure.
But, how fun! How fun,
Greg. We do want to ask, stepping out a bit more broadly. We'd love to ask you about churches that you've seen step into this space well. And by this space, I mean particularly caring well for anyone and everyone, no matter what their sexual story is or what their sexual orientation is, where their sexual attractions lie. And we want to I'll kind of to ask it to frame it in a question, want to say, how can non-affirming churches, which would describe us here at Christ Community, how can non-affirming churches like us care well for those in the LGBTQ community? How have you seen churches do that well? What would you encourage? We'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. If we were to separate the question into sort of two parts, because I think
please do.
There are sort of two different ways that I think churches can do well in this regard. One is kind of on the broader structural level. And the other is on sort of the more individual human level. And I think it is possible. I think it is possible for a church to be like a great church for an individual LGBTQ or same-sex attracted person seeking to follow Jesus, while being at the structural level still maybe not, a great church for folks generally. So if we distinguish those two things, I think on the individual level, a couple things that I think are really significant and helpful. One is just making sure that we have enough theological grounding that we are not treating LGBTQ or same-sex attracted folks like they are second-class citizens. For some churches, this feels very straightforward and easy and fits right in with their theological understanding. But for instance, I think if a church structurally as a church or has a lot of people within that church who would consider the experience of attraction to the same sex to be itself a morally culpable sin. So, if you're gay, you're attracted to the same sex, well, you need to repent of that. In a way that, I, as a person who's only attracted to, people of the opposite sex who are not my spouse, do not need to repent. I think if we have any kind of theological input that causes us to think, yes, there's something more fundamentally wrong with the LGBTQ or same-sex attracted person, apart from their theological understanding or their commitment to Jesus, I think if we hold that view, we maybe need to reread the beginning of Romans 2, because again, Paul seems relatively convinced that whatever else we take away from Romans 1, we should not take away, and that's why there are some people who are just inherently more sinful, and you're not one of them. Congratulations. Like, if you finish Romans 1 and you're patting yourself on the back, Romans 2 is really bad news.
Yeah.
So there are some theological pieces that I think are helpful there.
That's important. Yep.
Another that I think is in part theological, but is also very cultural, is just the way we think about and talk about and teach about marriage and singleness in the context of the church. Because I think whether we do it with intention, whether we do it with theological precision, or whether we just kind of do it by happenstance because it seems culturally convenient, I think lots of churches are places where there's this presumptive narrative that everybody who doesn't have, major issues in their lives and is sufficiently good looking can and should and will end up married. There are churches where only married men can be elders, which, I mean, I've already talked about the male and female thing, so I won't rant about that. But I just think it's wild to have an eldership structure at your church where both Jesus and the Apostle Paul are disqualified from eldership. Just seems like maybe you should have picked a different book than the New Testament to be your structural document if you didn't want Jesus and Paul to be elders. But I think even in context where we might say with our mouths, like, oh, sure, like singleness is good for some people, I think a lot of our church structures still assume that people ought to be kind of funneled into marriage. That singleness is more like the purgatorial, waiting zone where the losers hang out until they get their act together, which seems to miss something of the biblical understanding of singleness.
Yeah.
Right,
and overinflates marriage, I think, I can cause marriage to become an idol. Yeah, I think.
Cutter Calloway, who's a professor at Fuller, has a fabulous book called "Breaking the Marriage Idol," and in that book, he makes the argument, I think, really compellingly, that the problem with our current view of marriage and singleness is not that we've elevated marriage too highly, but and sort of denigrated singleness in the process, but it's actually that we've sort of pushed down both the value of both marriage and singleness, because we've said, like, oh yeah, pretty much everybody's called to marriage, and by doing that, we have missed sort of the distinct like height and difficulty of the value of the calling to marriage, because we make it sound like it needs to be a wide open enough gate that like any old person ought to be getting married. And so we lose the opportunity to talk about the really deep and challenging discipleship that's involved within marriage. But then in the process, we miss the invitation to call all kinds of people into deeply considering the possibility of whether God might ask them to be single. Right? It seems to me there are so many church contexts where like somebody like me could walk in as somebody who's gay and celibate. And, there are plenty of churches that are happy to say to me, like, oh, we're really glad that you're single, because as far as they're concerned, like, the alternative they think is worse than that. But if a straight person my age walks in, I guarantee you the first thought is like, are there some nice young ladies we can set this man up with? Like, we've got thoughts, we've got visions, we've got ideas. We're always praying for our children's future spouses when we could be praying for our children's discernment in marriage or singleness, as the Lord may call.
Wow.
That's right.
I just think until we start inviting straight people to seriously consider the possibility that God might ask them to be single, then it's no wonder that lots of the gay people don't feel like churches actually take singleness seriously or actually think it's a good thing. And I think we need to start thinking that singleness is a good thing. I think we actually need to start believing what the Bible has to say about the goodness of singleness in order to be the kinds of church communities where single gay folks can belong.
Well, and what's fascinating about the discipleship piece you're naming in marriage is that, in this text we were talking about where Jesus is talking about divorce, and the disciples listen to him in that moment talk about his teaching on marriage, and they're like, can anyone do this? Like, I don't they're kind of like, oh man, Jesus, this is a pretty high bar you're setting for marriage discipleship. I don't know if we can do this.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the way that Jesus' response to them in that moment is like, yeah, well, not everybody can do this, like it's only for some people.
Yeah.
And then he goes off into his piece about eunuchs, by which he seems to be speaking metaphorically about singleness. But I love that at the end of that whole conversation, having discussed the idea of people who live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom, he says, like, the one who can't accept this should accept it. Like, hey, if you can be single, like, that's a great idea. Right, and Paul too in 1 Corinthians 7,
that's right.
Which we're always quoting 1 Corinthians 7 to be like, it is better to marry than to burn with passion.
But wait,
right? Like we've
read
turned
the whole
1
chapter.
Corinthians 7 into a passage about why everybody ought to get married. When like the conclusion of 1 Corinthians 7,
that's right.
Paul's saying in there, like, well, the single man is concerned with the things of the Lord, but the married man is concerned with the things of the world. The single woman is devoted to the Lord in both body and mind, but the married woman, and at the end to have this wrap up where Paul says, like, so the one who marries, they do fine, but the one who does not marry does better. Right, like I think we should just have that read at our wedding ceremonies. I think that would really spice up the occasion.
Danny Cherweek, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name right.
Oh yeah,
but
I don't know if you're pronouncing her name correctly either, but I know who you are speaking of.
Yes, her stuff on 1 Corinthians 7 is outstanding. In fact, she was on Preston Sprinkle's podcast a while back, and it was so helpful on some of these very things we're talking about. She's in Australia. We'll link to a blog post that is so good by her in the show notes here, but deals with the very things you're naming, Greg. Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else that you'd want to add there, just in terms of, I mean, we are deeply committed at Christ Community, and I think, we've done our best, but we've got a ways to go. That's maybe how I'd grade us in wanting to be the type of community, church community that you're laying out a vision for. So any other kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'll say, and this speaks, I think, more to the structural piece, right? I was saying, like, there's a difference between, like, with the individual person and sort of the structural piece. And one of the structural pieces that I think is really significant is the question of how we conceive of and live out the church as family. Because I think for a lot of LGBTQ folks, for a variety of reasons, but especially for folks who find themselves called to singleness for the long haul, there's a big question about, like, what does that mean for me in the context of not building for myself the kind of family that I am sort of culturally predisposed to expect and to think should be the centerpiece of my entire life. And in the New Testament, we see this really beautiful vision of the body of Christ as family. We see these promises of God's provision of family to the ones who don't have family. And I think we have such great theological material to treat the church like a place where people who are called to not pursue family in the natural and legal and biological senses still have this deep and rich experience of family. And yet, despite having all that, my experience in conversation with many people is that they don't actually really experience their churches as family or as deeply meaningful community. That lots of churches are still mostly centered around the nuclear family unit, as if to say, like, church is the thing that we do where we all get together and you are equipped as a family unit to then go out and have your own family. And yeah, it seems to me that if we say, well, God could give me this whole massive family of God, or I could get, like, a spouse and 2.3 children for myself, like, theoretically, the option ought to be clear, and we ought to be way more excited about the family of God. And yet I think so many of us are like, family God, schmamily God, like, give me my spouse and 2.3 children. And I think the problem there is not with God's promise, but I think the problem is that so often we failed to live like that's really true.
That's right.
And so I think we need to be really, really bold, perhaps even a bit iconoclastic in the ways that we dare to reimagine what our life in community with one another might look like.
Yes.
Because I think until we do that, as long as church just feels like some peripheral addition, some Barbie accessory that we throw onto the fundamental family experience that comes with spouse and children, then we'll always be telling a story in which anybody who feels on the fringes of that will feel like, I don't know, this isn't the thing I was promised. This isn't the thing I saw in Scripture. And so that, I think, is a point of growth where so many of our churches, where our Big C church writ broadly, has a lot of growing to do.
Yeah, no, I don't think I really agree with that. And with my kids, I've got 3 kids, so not 2.3. But with my kids who are still little, I talk about. My wife Ashley and I talk about the 3 families. So we've got like our immediate family, the 5 of us. We have our extended family, and then we talk about the spiritual family. And really make a point of saying, and the spiritual family is the one that's most important. And I think sometimes we forget that the spiritual family is the one that endures into the new heavens and the new earth, right? I'm like constantly bringing us back to that they will neither marry nor be given in marriage in the new heavens and the new earth. And so it's obviously immediate families, those that have that, it's important, but it's imaging something, it's pointing towards, it's a signpost, to use your language from earlier. It's a signpost pointing somewhere else, but oftentimes we just stop right at the sign and forget to look where it's where it's pointing towards. So
yeah.
Well, and Greg, I might just ask another question here. And if someone's been with us and they've listened to us all the way up until this point, they've hung in there with us. I bet there's a lot of folks listening who would say, this all sounds good, and I really like this vision, but it just feels really hard for me to think about saying to my gay, lesbian neighbor, coworker, that if you really want to follow Jesus, if you really want to become a Christian, that's going to mean you have to kind of change the way that you think and practice your sexuality or your sexual expression. And I just wonder, how would you respond to that person who's just thinking like, this sounds really good. I just don't know how I can call my friend or my neighbor who maybe lives out this reality and they don't, as far as I know, follow Jesus. And this just seems like a huge, huge barrier to even beginning to invite them in. I just wonder, how might you respond, or what insight you would give to them in that?
Yeah, I'm generally of the persuasion that there's not a ton of point in us, before somebody has encountered Jesus, trying to cast visions and make arguments for them about what their life with Jesus will look like and why they ought to do this, that, or the other thing. It seems to me that really, until somebody has an encounter with Jesus, the fruitful conversation to have about Jesus is, okay, so there's this Jesus guy. He may totally wreck your life, as he has done with mine, and it's totally worth it. I feel like when I am interacting with folks who are not Christians, who are LGBTQ and are if they're just asking me about Jesus generally, usually I'm sort of leading with the Jesus side of the conversation and not getting into questions about sexual ethics, unless they ask about sexual ethics.
Right.
But when they ask about sexual ethics, as they sometimes do, what I'll often say is, well, here, let me explain my conviction. And it's maybe a bit easier for me to do that because there's a lot of my own personal story in it that I can share. But I'll always say, here's my conviction. There are some other Christians who are reading the same text that I am and reach a different conclusion, and I think they're wrong. They also think I'm wrong, and if you decide to follow Jesus, you're going to need to wrestle through those questions for yourself. And I'm not going to shortchange that process for you. I'm not going to, if and when you decide you want to follow Jesus and you're wrestling through those questions, I will gladly wrestle through all of them with you. But what I'm most convinced of is that falling in love with Jesus, if it's really falling in love with Jesus, makes all the things that come downstream of that love seem worth it.
That's right.
Come on.
Such that the question of so you're telling me I can't love the person I want to love. No, I'm telling you that at least in my experience, I just fell in love with a 2,000-year-old Jewish dude that has really complicated my efforts to fall in love with anyone else subsequently. Now, how that plays out for you, I will not presume to know. But I think the invitation is always an invitation into Jesus. And the question of how Jesus walks with you will be messy and complicated, and I have my hunches about where it will land. And I think wherever it lands, there will be a lot of grief and a lot of loss and a lot of death to self. And I think on the other side of those things, there will be a beauty that is so much more beautiful than anything that you could have dared to dream for yourself.
Thank you for that, Greg.
Yeah. As we kind of turn maybe towards wrapping up a little bit, I wonder if you could mention a couple of resources. We've certainly kind of hit on some more organically as we've gone throughout the conversation, but for any of our listeners, no matter what their story is, that might be looking to engage a little further, where would you point them?
Yeah. So I work with an organization called the Center for Faith, Sexuality and Gender. Our website is centerforfaith.com. And so there are lots of different pieces of the conversation depending on what you're looking for. We've created some pastoral papers if you're interested in diving into specific subsets of the theological conversation. There are video series for youth and parents of LGBTQ kids and LGBTQ folks themselves and pastors and church leaders. So those are some great resources. There are tons of good books. I've written a couple that are, moderate to passing. There are better books. You should read other people's books before you read mine. If you want a single book list, there's a podcast called Life on Side B. I think their website is lifeonsideb.com. And if you go to their resource page, I think it's just Life on Side B /books. But if you go to the resource page, they have a book list that has a really fabulous list of books that includes memoirs of just people's personal stories, some good books on theology, some books on church and community. There's a fabulous history of the ex-gay movement by Greg Johnson called Still Time to Care. Anyway, that book list has a fabulous bunch of books that I'd encourage you to check out. That is an inexhaustive list. There are so many more things that could be said, but I hear we're wrapping up, so I'm going to shut up.
No, that's amazing. That's great. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, Greg, as we do wrap up, we always ask our guests in this podcast just it's a get to know question at the end. But you've done so many different things. You're a writer, you're a thinker. You've done so many different things in this kind of space. But if you had a chance to do a different career altogether, do a different job, I would just love to hear what would Greg Coles do if he wasn't the amazing writer, thinker, speaker that he is? What other thing would you that fantasy career would you love to have? Like I always say, I'd love to be I love being a pastor. Wouldn't want to do anything else. But if I could be a national park ranger, oh man, that would be awesome. Just hang out in the parks. I was an Eagle Scout. I love that. So that would be my thing. I'd say I'd be a national park ranger. I'm just curious, what would you do?
So, while I was in grad school, I did some part-time work at a bakery, and I think my alternate career, I would just work at a bakery. Oh, it was so much fun.
What did you love about it?
So I'm a really big fan of physically rhythmic activities that leave room to think.
That's right.
I also love really tangible progress. So I was working at the bakery while I was working on my PhD. And there's something about when you're writing a dissertation where all that happens in a day is you wake up, you read some things, you write some things, you close your laptop, and everything looks exactly the same as it did before. All that has changed is I shoved some words around, my brain has a slightly different set of information now, which is so different so then I would go into the bakery, and I would start the day with bags of powdered sugar and piles of butter and and I would end the day with my record. One day I made 301 pounds of buttercream icing in a single day.
Oh my gosh!
So I'd end the day with buckets and buckets and buckets of icing. And there was something.
That's so much icing.
It's so much. It is. I am single-handedly responsible for some of America's health problems, I think. But there's something so gratifying about seeing physically, tangibly, the world has changed, and I have been a part of it in a meaningful way.
Yeah, that's awesome.
It's beautiful.
Well, we love that answer, and we love the time that we got to spend with you, Greg. And so thank you so much for joining us. And we'll have lots of links, lots of resources mentioned in the show notes. And we appreciate the time. And all our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in.